Welcome back to the Embodied Faith podcast. And the questions we're looking at today is how can we move from just surviving to thriving? Why do we always feel out of sorts with the world? Kind of like we're not fitting in the way we should. And is it the case that our human nature is the cause, but possibly the solution to all these problems? And then lastly, can evolutionary psychology actually help us bridge the gap? As always, I'm Jeff Holsclaw, and this is the Embodied Faith podcast, where we're seeking to integrate neuroscience, spirituality, and faith, brought to you by Grassroots Christianity, which is growing faith for everyday people. Today we're joining the program today is Justin Barrett. He is the president of the nonprofit called Blueprint 1543. He previously held positions at Fuller Graduate School of Psychology as professor of psychology, as well as directed the Thrive Center for Human Development. And most recently, he has written a book called Thriving with Stone Age Minds, Evolutionary Psychology, Christian Faith, and the Quest for Human Flourishing. Dr. Barrett, welcome to the podcast.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, the question I ask most people when they jump on is, well, how did you just get interested in this field, and how was it that you started integrating kind of the science and the faith of this particular field? How did you jump into this?
Oh, this one was a long time coming. I'm a cognitive developmental psychologist who's studied religious cognition, religious thought for a long time. And increasingly, I was seeing how evolutionary psychology was sort of making inroads into the kind of space that I was working in. And I wasn't sure I was comfortable with that, to be quite honest. Because of a lot of the excesses that we sometimes see around evolutionary psychology. Sometimes it's talked about like humans are nothing but, I don't know, a bunch of reproductive instincts, for instance. You can reduce us to that in some way, or any other number of these sort of biological drives and urges. And that all there is to humans is this sort of, it's a survival package to carry our genes around or something like that. And so that kind of excess always put me on my heels a little bit to evolutionary psychology. But the more I learned about evolutionary theory generally, and the more I learned about evolutionary psychology in particular, I thought, well, there is some good stuff in here too. Maybe it's not packaged the right way. Maybe there's some excesses, but at least there's some good stuff. And so I actually tried to encourage some of my other colleagues who are Christians and knew evolutionary theory a lot better than I did to write a book that would introduce particularly evangelicals to this idea of evolutionary psychology in a constructive kind of way, instead of just in a defensive or destructive kind of ways. And no, we don't want anything to do with that, but more to, okay, where's the good here? Where can we find it? And is there hope for appropriating some ideas from evolutionary psychology the right way? Is there a chance for redeeming this field? And frankly, I couldn't get anybody to write the book. So I finally, at a certain point, just gave up.
You're kind of like one of those congregants who goes to the pastor and is like, it'd really be good if we had this kind of ministry. And then the pastor's like, well, why don't you start that ministry? So they came back with you, and they said,
maybe.
And they said, why don't you write the book? Okay.
Yeah, why don't you write the book? And, I was able to persuade my colleague at Fuller, Pam King, to help me out with that. And so we did with some other Fuller colleagues. We started this process of just some discussion groups and sharing ideas with some other people who, have other expertise, and then put this book together. And the angle that's a little different from a regular introductory textbook is that instead of just saying, okay, here's evolutionary psychology, here's the good, the bad, and the ugly, now deal with it, we said, well, what if we take this evolutionary psychology stuff and try to apply it to a problem that Christians care about, human flourishing or thriving, and what that looks like, and see, well, does it deliver the goods in this area? How is it helpful, and where are its limitations? And I found that a really helpful exercise in wrestling with this area that's a little scary, evolutionary psychology, because I could then really keep my eyes focused on what matters. And that's that we're becoming the kind of people living the full lives that really God intends us to live.
Great. Well, so to be honest, and I told you this before we, press play, is I was a little skeptical of the book also when I started for those same reasons. This podcast tries to take like a relational neuroscience kind of approach, which is kind of agnostic about, well, where did all this stuff come from? Where did our attachment kind of system come from? And all these different kind of things, because sometimes that can be very speculative, in the literature that I read. And like you said, it can be very reductionistic, like humans are just X, Y, and Z, or something like that. But you really avoid that approach. So could you just go through and say, well, real briefly, what is evolutionary psychology, at least in the way that you found helpful, and what does that mean for you?
Yeah, so evolutionary psychology, you're right, can mean a lot of different things. But in this context, evolutionary psychology is the approach to the study of human thought and action. Okay, that's psychology. It is the science of human thought and action that takes seriously the possibility that we are descended from other kinds of species. That is, humans have ancestral species that were not like us, or at the very least, human history is very deep. It's hundreds of thousands of years old. And so, because of that, most of human existence has been shaped by the kind of environmental demands on our species: survival, reproduction, child rearing, whatever those fitness demands are from those environments from the last 2, 3, 400,000 years at least. And because of that, then we can approach the study of contemporary human thought and behavior by saying, wow, there's probably some hangovers or some residual features of why we think the way we do, why we feel the way we do, our impulses, our desires, that are actually suited to the biggest history of the human past. You might think our Stone Age minds is what we've got in this contemporary world. And that gives us a different angle on why people act the way they do. So that's the theoretical background of evolutionary psychology. But when it's doing its science thing, it has the same demands, or at least should meet the same demands as any other area of science. There should be, that theoretical perspective should generate testable hypotheses that then people go and gather new, fresh data to try to falsify or support those hypotheses and so forth. So that's very quickly, it's sort of this evolutionary psychology approach. Is that enough to go on?
Yeah, no, that's great. Well, and I think I want to follow it up with this. So you're saying like evolutionary psychology, speaks about the human mind, and that really is very broadly construed as, all of our, embedded cognitions, and all of our or extended cognitions and embedded relationships and all these types of things. But you mentioned that, it's really asking the question, well, how have we been shaped by environmental demands? And really, these are fitness demands, which is the surviving kind of question, and how do we thrive? But then there's this idea of like fitting into a niche, or a niche, depending on where and when you learn that word. So we'll just say niche for now. I'm assuming that's the way you're using it. NICHE. And so, all organisms fit into a niche in some fashion. And if they don't, then they die. But humans seem to be particularly unique in that. So can you kind of walk through how is it that it's our nature to not only fit into a niche, but also to actually construct and change them?
Right, right. Yeah, so this idea of niche is really important. And I had a biologist friend sort of explain it to me this way, that our environment you can think of as like an address where you live, and your niche is your occupation. So for us as a species, our niche is that interface between who we are and the environment we live in, that we have to act into in order to survive and thrive and whatever it is, to meet these fitness demands. And one of the things that we argue in the book is that humans seem to be unusual among species to at least the degree to which we're constantly changing our niches. Okay, we're changing the way that we have to interact with the world around us because we're changing the world around us. Okay, so the fitness demands are constantly changing. So once upon a time, you could think, well, our ancestors way back are all hunter gatherers, and so the being a hunter gatherer, I don't know, in the savannah or someplace in Africa like that, right? You've got a certain kind of environment that then hits us with certain kinds of demands. We have certain size groups that we're living in. That then shapes the kind of organism we are and how we're going to survive and get along with each other and cooperate and so forth and so on. But then we go and change that. We move from hunter-gatherers to horticulturalists. So we start doing sort of small scale monkeying with the plants around us and bringing some in and kind of starting a little bit of small scale cultivation, which then, of course, we know leads eventually to agriculture, where not only are we now domesticating animals and plants, but we're changing landscapes. We're clear cutting forests. We're building larger and larger settlements. All of those are changing the niche that we live in. Okay. So then the demands on us fitness wise, how we're going to navigate just basic survival, how we're going to make babies, how we're going to raise up those babies so that they can have babies and all of that is changing with each time we sort of change our environment and thus change the niche. And that's a really interesting dynamic. It's allowed our species to spread all over the globe without fundamentally changing our genetics. Okay, so lots of animal types have spread all over the place, but usually they do it by their genes changing. Our species, our family even, has done this in a different sort of way, and that's by really changing the environment as we go, changing the niche requirements as we go. So, and that's where, I'm sorry, I'm being a little funny, that idea between niche and environment, they're overlapping, but not quite the same. Because, wearing clothes is part of our niche now. Using tools is part of our niche. And we don't normally think of those as the environment. They are part of the developmental environment or niche that babies are growing into nowadays.
Well, this idea of like adapting or living into the niche, at least when I was reading the book, it felt really important and kind of a huge aha moment, because it's not just that we're changing the environment willy-nilly. It's that we're creating adaptive solutions to an environmental problem that then creates down the line other problems, unforeseen problems, that then we have to create new solutions to. And so you mentioned different examples like antibiotics and even our teeth construction. And so can you talk about that really quick, just as a practical way to kind of get at the how our past solutions create new problems, and as a way of kind of understanding, like we have these Stone Age minds, but we now have these modern problems. So can you just talk about those two things just as an illustration for people to understand how a niche solution can create new problems?
Yeah, good. Yeah. No, I was sort of blown away by the whole mouth construction thing, because as I was writing this book, I was actually going through having orthodontal work.
Mm-hmm.
And when anything like, and I learned like, oh yeah, roughly half of us need orthodontal work now. At least that's what the orthodontists say. And my sort of cynical side says, yeah, orthodontists have lots of boats to pay for, vacation homes.
Yeah, but a lot of Disneyland to visit.
Yeah, that's right. So, but as I started looking into it, I realized, okay, that was unfair. At least maybe that's not the whole story. It does turn out that compared to about 200 years ago, let's say, we do have a lot more orthodontal and dental problem.
Okay, so 200 years is not that long ago.
It's not that long ago. So what's happened? It's not a big genetic shift. So they, researchers have done things like looked at, dug up teeth in graveyards in parts of Scandinavia where the population genetics has not changed. They haven't had mass migration. These are the same, they're looking at their great-great-grandparents' teeth, and they had much better teeth and jaws, and they didn't have orthodontal problems, but their descendants now do. What's going on there? And a lead view on this seems to be that, well, with industrialization and with industrialized agriculture, we've got to solve problems like getting everybody fed and to get babies good nutrition that then they're not going to choke on and things like that, we start developing these great things like baby food. Nice, smooth, soft things they're not going to choke on, that they can sort of wean easily into this stuff, and then from there into regular foods. And that seems great. It's solving a problem. But it turns out it changes the developmental environment on our jaws and our teeth, such that our jaws don't develop with the same musculature. And so they don't sort of spread and get big enough. And so our teeth get more and more crowded with our weak jaws, because we are not growing up sort of gnawing on bones and, chewy meats and fibrous roots and things like that. We've mechanized all of that so we don't have to do it. So we're kind of weak and feeble in the mouth. And that means, okay, now we need orthodontics. And so orthodontics then is a solution to a problem that we created trying to solve another problem. Another example is these guys, right? I mean, you and I both wear glasses, apparently. Well, why do we need to wear glasses?
I guess
this one's slightly different.
Weak and feeble eyes is my guess.
But in this case, I think the answer is slightly different. It's that, well, we read books.
Hey, wait, what? Wait.
We need to use our eyes to focus on little bitty things that our ancestors didn't need to focus on little bitty things. But to make our lives better, for all kinds of fitness reasons, we've become literate people who use our eyes in lots of different ways. And you don't even need literacy. You can think of fine weaving, basket work, clothing making, stuff you need not just dexterity, but really, good eyesight for. Well, that then means, okay, now we need better visual acuity longer in life. And well, that's not the way our biology works. By the time we're all about 40 years old, we start losing what visual acuity we might have had. Now, it could be that we're also wearing those out. I'm not an expert on eyes, but I do know that it matters now in a way it didn't matter before. Right? Being able to see more precisely matters in a way it didn't, because our environment has changed, the demands on us, thus our niche has changed. And so there are lots of these little interesting examples out there of how to solve one problem, we create new problems. Then we try to solve those problems and it creates new problems, and so forth and so on.
Excellent. Well, good. So that's how we kind of create these gaps. And that's also how culture and environments kind of, and our niche changes and moves forward. Now you focus in, and this is where I think the real meat of the book comes in, is you focus in on 3 specific human traits that differentiate us from other animals, as being, hyper social, being information, kind of gathering and using information at a entirely different level, and then having self-control in a certain way. And so I'd love just to kind of go through those, or maybe just pick one of those that's your favorite, and just talk about how, like, these fundamental aspects of our human nature are falling into a lot of pressure, because, like you said, we have these Stone Age kind of minds and practices, and we're adapted to this Stone Age niche in one sense, and yet our environment, our culture is really taxing those, and so there's these large gaps. Is that right?
Yeah, you've captured that nicely.
So then, which one do you want to start off with? Which one?
Well, let's talk about sociality. That's
okay.
A good one. Yeah.
All right.
Yeah. So 3 big bundles of traits that seem to set humans apart from other kind of animals. One of those is that we are immensely social kinds of animals. We live in much bigger groups of particular individuals that we track those individual identities. We pay attention to who they are, what they think, what their motivations are, and so forth. But it's not without limits. Okay. We are extreme among many animals in terms of the size and complexity of our social networks. But that doesn't mean we can have relationships with any number of individuals that we like. Rather, it means that we should expect severe limitations, even if we're on the outer end. And it turns out research suggests that, yeah, we do. Our social minds, part of what makes us such amazing animals, because we can share information, we can teach each other, we can learn from each other, we can co-parent with each other, we can support child rearing. This is how we address a lot of fitness problems, is through this sociality. But it looks like we've got sort of natural rings of intimacy that ripple out. With it's easiest for us to have super close, tight relationships with about 4 or 5 other people. Well, 3, 4, yeah, about 5 is our sort of core inner ring. And then we've got another ring of intimacy, about 15 out from there, plus or minus a few. And then another ring of about 50. And then sort of our big personal network of about 150. Again, with lots of variation around this. The point is we've got relational capacity limits. And they fit really well with most of human history, because you probably wouldn't have run into more than about 150 people in normal life, right? Because villages, ancient villages, sort of topped out around 150. Even if they got bigger, you might have sort of a sub area that's just, your folks that you know pretty well. And because that number of relationships in your environment would have fit what your mind was good for, you can kind of keep track of who's related to whom, who's mad at whom at this moment, who I can trust, who I can't, who's angry with me, preferences, and so forth, and we can get along. And we don't need lots of policing, and we don't need lots of social structures and so forth. But there are really good reasons for building larger and larger communities, scales of economies of scale, being able to cooperate on larger projects like irrigation, defense against invaders and other villages that might want to hurt us, all kinds of sort of different pressures to get bigger. But there's a cost to that getting bigger in terms of social group sizes, and that's that it exceeds what our minds are good at. We can't track everybody as individuals anymore. We've exceeded our relational capacity. And so we start de-individualizing people. We clump them into groups instead for cognitive efficiency. We treat them as anonymous others, or we need other kinds of mechanisms to get us there. So this one worries me a lot in our current era, because this idea that we're immensely social, then we need social interaction. That's what we're wired for. Then gets frustrated by these electronic technologies when we use them to try to take the place of regular interpersonal relationships. And I think a lot of us in these various COVID-related lockdowns have seen that. Anxiety is going up. People feel isolated. They feel depressed. Why? They're not getting the right kind of human interaction. But even pre-COVID, we've seen that in just urban environments where we've got too many people around us. It's stressing us on the other end. We've got too much social sort of bombardment. And so it's not a surprise to me anyway, from this perspective, that urban centers is where we see crime rates going up. Cities are dangerous places for people. And I think in part that's because our natural sociality doesn't fit urban environments very well. It's kind of a misfit that we're forcing to fit through all kinds of institutional structures. So there's a blessing and a curse there. We have to hit the optimum right to sort of suit our nature around our sociality. Too much?
No, that's so good. Well, just to be, practical, you mentioned, kind of the question, well, how is it that, and I could be bringing some examples in that maybe you didn't.
Go ahead, yeah.
But how is it that someone could be murdered in an apartment building when most of the people heard the violence and nobody called 911? Or you use an example of a bicyclist who is injured on the ground at a busy kind of intersection, who ends up dying because nobody does anything, even though hundreds of people walked by them. And it's this idea that you mentioned that now we're kind of, there's so many people that then everyone becomes anonymous, and yet we still kind of socially conform. That's in our nature to kind of be in group conformity, but then we group conform in an anonymous state, and we see everybody ignoring so-and-so person. And so we just kind of continue to do that. And so now we've lost the ability to care for one another, so there's this kind of mismatch between our longing to be social, but then we end up doing horrible things because of that.
Yeah, that's right.
And so there's this huge mismatch. And I think it sounds, so I'm just speculating here, but it sounds like, because we long to be social, but now we've kind of exceeded our capacity to kind of connect with people in an intimate sense or a true sense. Would you say that maybe filling that gap is all an increase in biases, prejudices, or stereotypes, because we're not actually engaging with people? And so we're just kind of creating these cognitive layers of concepts, thinking using them as a substitute for actual social interaction?
I think we do that. Yeah, that's right. So I mean, I can even reflect on my own experience when I used to do youth ministry. I used to do ministry with Young Life, and your sort of job in that role is to go out and make friends for Jesus and stuff. But very quickly, I found between the number of relationships I had with the leadership team that I was part of, the staff people in the area, the adult supporters, then key teachers and principals and coaches that I'm having relationships with, and then key kids. Now I've quickly exceeded my sort of relational capacity, but I'm supposed to go out and keep making more personal, genuine relationships. And lots of people in pastoral positions, I think, can resonate with this experience. And what do you end up doing? Well, you start clumping people. Oh, it's the track team guys. So now I don't have to individuate them the same way. Or it's, those cool kids over there who are involved with this. All right. Okay. So now I don't actually have to individuate them. So I have these cognitive strategies to start clumping them into bigger and bigger groups, as well as just going very broad but thin relationally. Right. And we can't kick ourselves over that. That's just a natural human limitation. And you can only sort of come up with little cheat sheets for learning names and stuff like that for so long, and the machinery breaks. So what we end up doing, I think, in the kinds of environments we find ourselves in now are importing these sort of groupisms, where we're sort of creating clumps of types of people. And instead of treating them as individuals, we start treating them as members of groups. That's one of our strategies for for dealing with this enormous social pressure in some ways. Or we just ignore people, right?
Yeah.
Exactly. We just walk down the street. We don't even acknowledge them. We just don't. Why? Well, it's too much. If we acknowledged everybody, we couldn't do it in most urban settings, right?
Yeah. Well, good. Well, first off, if you're listening live, which some people are, you can ask questions or make comments. And I have a friend here in Grand Rapids who is making a comment. He says, it's not too much. It's not too much. This is really good. So the details, not too much. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks.
Yeah. So it's not just me who agrees that this is great. It's we at least have one other vote. Well, so I'm just going to skip the information education gap, although that's really important. Could you say something just about self-control? What is the nature of self-control, and how is it? How is there a gap now in our modern society from our Stone Age mind that's creating, I think, problems?
Good. Yeah. One of the really cool things about being a human being is we've got these sort of massive foreheads, some a little bit bigger than others, foreheads, that house our prefrontal cortex, which is, among many things, is known as the seat of the jargon is, executive function. But a big part of that is our ability to control ourselves deliberately. Okay. And that sets us apart from almost every other species. And certainly the degree to which we can sort of regulate ourselves, control ourselves, is unparalleled as far as we can tell in other animals. So what? Who cares? Well, what that enables us to do is sort of reflect on possible actions before we take them, evaluate many more pieces of information before acting. It enables us to override our emotional reactions. If we get too angry, too sad, whatever, too happy, we can sort of dial it back and go, okay, not now. let's not go crazy, or let's reevaluate. It enables us to learn more systematically and slowly. We don't sort of rush ahead. All these great things about being such a self-controlled animal, right? Okay, but again, it's not an infinite capacity. It's got certain kinds of limitations. It's been helpfully compared to like a muscle. Your self-control is a bit like a muscle, in that for it to get stronger, you need to exercise it. But while you're exercising it, sort of immediately after it's been extremely exercised, it seems to get a little weak and flabby. Okay, so it can be overwhelmed. You can do too much too fast, just like if you sort of, pump lots of iron and stuff. Okay, right afterwards, I'm tired, I'm flabby, I can't do anything. Okay, so if we think of that as a metaphor for our self-control muscle, then what we want I think, to develop in our self-control is enough challenges that we can exercise that muscle and get it stronger and stronger and stronger. And good parenting and educational systems do this with kids. They give kids opportunity to, all right, you need to sit still now. Okay, just for a couple of minutes, okay, I can do this. Okay, but not overdo it so that they're doomed to fail.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, but what then happens in these new contemporary kinds of niches where we do have anonymity, maybe to a higher degree than we ever have before, at least perceived anonymity. We aren't surrounded by people who know us, who are invested in our good, who are checking on us so that we don't misbehave. We use the Christian-y term accountability. We don't have good accountability. Well, then maybe we don't have other people helping us use that self-control muscle quite as judiciously as we might otherwise. And we might have too many temptations around, especially when we feel ourselves depleted because there's so many things we're supposed to do, so many decisions we have to make, so many things that are tempting us that we have to say no to. I lived overseas for a while. I was on the faculty at Oxford University in the UK. And it's an ancient medieval kind of city. So it isn't all populated with lots of billboards and advertising and that kind of thing. And that's, of course, much more common in the United States than in the United Kingdom anyway. And then when I moved back to the Los Angeles area, back to the United States, I moved to the Los Angeles area. And suddenly it was shocking just how much temptation was around constantly, right? There are opportunities to spend your money everywhere, right? Shops and smells and advertising and billboards and always trying to get you to act, that you're constantly having a no. And at a certain point, if you're not careful, of course, you're just going to get self-control exhausted. And that donut shop is just going to be a bridge too far. And you're going to wander in there, right? But that's the kind of environment we've constructed around ourselves, maybe particularly in a lot of urban settings in the United States, where it's constant temptation. It's constantly wearing at our self-control muscle too much. So that it's not surprising that we snap at our spouses. It's not surprising if we're tempted to kick the dog or misbehave at work or, by, just watching cat videos instead of doing our work. We are just exhausted in terms of our self-control. So that's sort of one side. The other side is we may be slipping into also different kinds of parenting and educational patterns that are just too much for kids or not enough for kids. It's really hard to get that sort of tuning right. If you're overly permissive as a parent, your kids never learn self-control. Mm-hmm. If you're sort of too controlling, they never get a chance to exercise their self-control. So that's kind of the middle path that we've got to find as parents, as educators, as pastors, as community leaders, whatever it is.
Well, I'm one of those villains, book villains who writes in the book. And so right when I got to that self-control section, I wrote the Goldilocks zone for it has to
Goldilocks,
it has to be just enough independence so that you can flex the, self-control muscle, but not so much independence that you just become exhausted, overwhelmed, and give up, and therefore never grow the muscle. And so there's this Goldilocks zone. I did while I was preparing for this episode, I was thinking, oh man, we could just do multiple episodes on self-control in this. Well, to start wrapping things up though, so we're talking about these kind of niche gaps that have been created from our kind of Stone Age minds and that kind of our new contemporary modern world, cities, technology, all these temptations and things like that. And so it's this idea that maybe we don't feel like we're flourishing because we're kind of stuck in these gaps, and we need to be more creative as communities and churches and schools and families to help people kind of fit into these gaps. Or, and some people are like, well, we'll just create more technology to solve these gaps. We'll see how that goes. But part of the purpose of your book is to say, well, evolutionary psychology actually can't give us all of the purposes for which we kind of work toward. And so there's some that you mentioned near the end of the book, like there is kind of a spiritual, transcendent kind of striving, or kind of a spiritual niche, and I don't think you say it that way, that we try to fit into where we're seeking God's purposes in the world. And so I just want to finish off by talking about that a little bit. How do you see this kind of interacting with kind of faith and some of the being made in God's image, and loving God and loving neighbors and these types of things?
Yeah, thanks. This is definitely one of the areas in which some of maybe the most visible champions of evolutionary everything, including evolutionary psychology, I think have oversold what it can deliver.
Mm-hmm.
Evolutionary psychology can tell us a lot of interesting things about human nature, but it can't tell us what we should do with it. To that, I think we need to turn to something like Christian theology. Tell us, well, what does that thriving, flourishing life look like, and how do we get it? But I think putting the two together is really interesting. And it's interesting for the following reason. If you think God created humans in his image, that means he had a purpose. And a lot of times theologically, when we talk about what it means to be created in God's image, because of the way the biblical texts read on this, there's often an immediate connection with what we're supposed to do with that image, that imaging. There's a lot of disagreement around this, but we see that imaging God is quickly followed by being God's stewards in the world, by taking care of creation, by acting as God's representatives. It's sometimes noted that idea of image suggests something like the representatives of the emperor, like an image on a coin. There are lots of metaphors for this, right? But clearly we have some kind of capacities that God has built that enable us to serve the functions that God would have us serve. And the more we do that, the more we approximate living into that image. And we'd say Jesus is the perfect image. So the more we imitate him, the more we're imaging God, the more we thrive, the more we flourish. Okay, that we're getting that from Christian theology. But notice in there are ideas that we're bringing in about, well, what is this humanness? What is that nature that seems to set us apart? Well, that's where the evolutionary sciences, including evolutionary psychology, can help us. It can help us understand those capacities, understand our properties, our human nature a little more completely, so that then we can go, all right, we'll take that, we'll plug that into that normative framework we get from theology. So it tells us what we ought to do with that now that we understand it. Okay. And so we seem to be the species then that has this capacity. Well, we're hypersocial, and that tells us something about how we ought to live with each other. We really ought to be in close community with each other because it's just part of who we are. And so doing life as a human well means doing that well. And we acquire expertise that's relevant to our local situation, and we share that expertise with others. And so caring for our culture around us, sharing and receiving information from each other so that we can care for that creation around us, seems to be part of our nature. And we're all doing all of that through our ability to control ourselves and regulate. All right. So all of these things weave together. At least that's what we're trying to argue in the book, right? But then, so what's the problem there? The challenge is, how do we take those capacities and we align them with God's purposes for us? But as we've said, we've changed that niche a little bit. So sometimes I think we get distorted pictures of what it is to sort of live with that purpose that God has given us. Sometimes I think we think of it too much in terms of the local particularities. So one of the things we do at the end of the book is talk about, well, zooming back, this evolutionary perspective that looks at humanity over 200, 300,000 years, does that give us a different insight onto what should I be doing right now?
Mm-hmm.
Only so far, but it does give us some hints. Like, this bothered some people who read the book, I know, but I want to suggest that it would be very surprising, for instance, if really God created a third of adolescent males to be professional athletes. And those aren't arbitrary things. Research shows that about a third of adolescent males think their big thing in life is to be an athlete. And I was one of those. I identified as an athlete in high school.
Mm-hmm.
Well, even from an evolutionary perspective, set aside theology for a second. If we were all athletes, could we actually function? Would that be good for our species? Probably not, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, that's a product of a very artificial and strange environment. And so that's probably not our core purpose, just from an evolutionary perspective, let alone from a theological one. So it gives us a sort of an outside look into Christianity and go, probably not that. And so I want to develop the argument that anything that relies too much on contemporary particular environmental conditions, too many of these artifacts, too much of this artificially constructed niche, is probably not the core purpose of humanity. Mm-hmm. Maybe we should take a step back from that and say, those are the means by which we could pursue what God really calls us to do. But what God calls us to do and what the flourishing life consists of is probably these more basic things that apply to the broadest sweep of humanity. Loving each other well, loving God well, exercising our ability to get new information to solve new problems for the sake of representing God in his creation and stewarding that well, and exercising the self-control in service of those ends. So that's kind of where I'm headed with this, and it's kind of tentatively and
I like it,
but
I think it's always really great. Like, well, how does this help a high school student or a college student, or something like that? And the quest for human flourishing is important, but like you said, evolutionary psychology can't give us the what should we do. It just says, well, what are we typically really good at, and how we develop these types of things. And you kind of mentioned at the end of the book, you need to make a distinction. We all need to make distinctions between our primary purpose, which is something like conforming and being transformed into the image of God and loving others, and loving ourselves. And from our secondary purposes, which might be for us, being professors and writing books, or being a doctor, or being a school teacher, these types of things. But if we kind of hitch our whole well-being to one of those secondary purposes, then if you lose your job, or if we get injured and we can't be that, star athlete, then we're really going to feel the lack of thriving. It's really going to hurt. And we're really going to be questioning kind of our whole kind of purpose in this world or whatnot. But if we have hitched our kind of thriving that we're aiming toward to the primary purposes of, being conformed to Christ and loving God and being within a thriving community and helping that community itself thrive according to God's, kingdom, then even if we kind of fall out of step with one of those particular secondary callings, then we just reorient, kind of the way we humans have always done, is we've adapted and reoriented and kind of moved along. So I thought that was really helpful.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, what I found myself with talking to younger people who are trying to make this transition into, okay, what job should I take? And they're Christian people. I find myself saying, well, look, instead of only considering what's going to make me money, what am I sort of particularly good at, what tickles my fancy and stuff, also consider what's the environment in which you are going to become more like Christ, right? What's the environment that's going to shape your character into the character that God wants from you? Mm-hmm. And there is an individual personal dimension to that, right? But it's not so individualistic that we can just say, you know what, none of it matters. This is my passion. I'm gonna be a saxophone player or whatever it is. It's like, yeah, because you could break your hands and you can't play the sax anymore. And then what? Well, that's not your ultimate aim.
I was actually, or I am married to a concert musician for whom that happened, and in college he had to like pivot, I'm going to be a professional musician, and tendonitis just nope, it's not going to happen, for sure. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Barrett, for being on the show. This is the book. I'm showing it on the live feeds. This is Thriving with the Stone Age Minds, Evolutionary Psychology, Christian Faith, and the Quest for Human Flourishing. I know you've worked in other, like you said, cognitive science fields and religion and purpose and these types of things, so maybe I could convince you to jump on to talk about some of that other stuff, but I really appreciate it.
Yeah, it's been fun to talk. Thanks for having me.
And I know Jim Decker's been on listening the whole time, so he's enjoyed it also. So, where can people find you if they want to track you down or some of your work or follow you?
Probably the best place to find me and what I'm up to is on the Blueprint 1543 website. So that's www.blueprint1543.org.
Excellent. And this is the Embodied Faith podcast. You can find us wherever podcasts are supplied. You can find this on Spotify. We're also on YouTube, and you can find me just my name, Jeffrey Holsclaw, Jeff with a G, on Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube. So please continue to follow along and asking great questions. Thanks again, and maybe I can convince you to be on again sometime.
All right. It was fun to talk.
All right. See ya.
See ya.